All right, well, this has obviously been a very great day, I think, for justice in South Carolina. Obviously, Alex Murdaugh has pled guilty to these financial offenses from the state grand jury, and he's been sentenced to a sentence of 27 years of 85% time. This was something that the state agreed to for a number of reasons. First of all, again, a sentence that I think Judge Newman called very stern. I don't think anyone, as I said in court, state or federal, has seen a sentence like that for charges of this nature. But additionally, we're able to save these victims, save these communities the expense of trial after trial, and ultimately get to tell the entire story of how Alex Murdaugh abused the judicial system, how he made use of his power and his influence and this law license to do so. And I think that's a big important point of this today as well, is to have that exposed, have that addressed in state court where it belongs, and have the state court system speak on it and then begin its own process of healing and improving from the experiences that this case has brought to us. I want to thank, of course, the Attorney General Alan Wilson, who's been instrumental and in leadership in this case from the beginning, and also my partners at SLED, my state grand jury team. You see a couple of them standing right here. I've got Johnny James and Carson Burney, who are my two financial white-collar guys who do such a great job, among so many others at SLED and among the state grand jury staff, and they've really been instrumental in all of this. And then I also want to thank, as I did in court, the victims, and particularly those initial victims and their attorneys who came forward. Some of them were unrepresented at the time, but they really showed a lot of courage in this case early on. It's really hard to conceive of it now that we're kind of on the other side of this part of the tale, but at the beginning there was a lot of difficult feelings as to whether or not anything would ever be done, and we're happy that this result today has shown that it will be. So I'll take a couple of questions if anybody has any.
What more restitution?
You had a pretty clear path to 3 strikes. Why didn't you go ahead and go with that, considering you already sort of had it all laid out as you had talked about?
Well, again, we got 27 years at 85%. In our judgment, that is practically a life sentence. And again, we're talking about, what Colleton endured. That's a small county. They had to endure an incredible expense. And I think you heard Justin Bamberg talk about that all of these smaller counties, Allendale, Hampton, Bamberg, would have to pay for trial after trial after trial. And that's not a good use of judicial resources, not only for the judicial resources in those counties, and to have all those neighbors and friends of those victims have to essentially foot the bill for those trials, but it's not a good use of court time or really time for SLED in the Attorney General's office. As I said in court today, and I loved Justin Bamberg's slay the dragon analogy, we have a lot of other dragons to slay. We had a big announcement last week on some of our cases involving some of the issues at SCDC, some of the corruption there. We even announced where a child had been victimized in real time through use of a contraband cell phone. Another big focus at state grand jury is fentanyl trafficking, which is killing our citizens right and left. So if we can today put Alex Murdaugh in prison, where he also waives his appeals, waives his PCR, and provide that level of certainty and finality, and be able then to move on to new things with a certainty that he's going to be in prison for the rest of his life, regardless of what happens with the murders. And let's be clear, he's got 2 life sentences for murder, and those aren't going away. We're going to litigate that, and if we, for some reason, some small chance we have to retry it, we'll do that as well. But this ultimately provides the best result when all those factors are put together. Yes, sir.
Have all of his victims been made whole? If not, what happens then?
So we deferred a restitutionary figure, and the way I phrased it today is I wouldn't say anyone has been made whole. What I did say today is that in many instances the law firm paid the victims the net amount of what Alex had stolen, but that does not address any other claims that people may have, and so again, the state's job is to not get involved with that. That's for the civil side of things. What our job is to ensure that there's kind of an accountability for that net result. So for all those victims that were addressed today, there has at least been some payment made, but I'm never going to say that any of these victims who had their trust betrayed, who maybe had their money stolen back in 2011 and didn't get it back till last year, I will never say that anyone was made whole. The firm did cooperate and made an effort, again, to pay those net results back. They also were very cooperative in the investigation. The bank, Palmetto State Bank as well, was very cooperative in the investigation and made a lot of documents. And so both of those institutions institutions, I think, were harmed by the actions of Alec. But ultimately, whether or not anyone could ever be made whole in a situation like this, I don't think that's the appropriate term to use.
Is there a
Yes.
chance you'll have to retry him?
So you had a complex case with this financial crimes case, and you had
Right.
a complex case with the murderer. Can you express just how complex it really was? What did your office do? How many people? How many hours? I mean, it just seems like a lot.
Right. Well, the one thing about the job that I'm lucky enough to have as chief attorney of the state grand jury, and I have this team that we've constructed, is that that's our stock and trade, is to focus on complex cases, and that's why this case ultimately came to us, and that's why it was well suited. We have a long history of doing complex narcotics trafficking cases, which we again address those looking for the traffickers, looking for those larger conspiracies. We have a lot of experience at public corruption, a lot of experience at complex financial. So while it was a lot of work, it's the kind of thing that we're used to doing, and we also have developed the expertise and the resources to be able to take those deep dives into cases like this. And so ultimately, yes, was it a lot of work, but it's what the state grand jury was constructed to do, and ultimately, I think you see the results of that.
Is there a chance?
Go ahead.
Chance you're gonna have to retry him, and then are you gonna be that guy?
Well, I mean, there's been a motion filed. I'm not going to comment on any pending motion. We'll obviously litigate that motion, and then whatever happens after that, we'll address it at that time. Yeah.
Alex was talking. He said that by pleading guilty today, it made them look at him for all of the murder crimes instead of having fled, and he called out the AG's office for not looking at other people during the murders. What do you have to say to that?
I have to say that we presented our case in front of jurors in Colleton County, and they came to that result, and I think that result speaks for itself. Yes.
The defense said that the state essentially was not budging when it came to a plea deal. I mean, this happened 2 weeks before we were supposed to go to a trial. Now, you said today in court that this was the best case scenario for everyone involved. What was the holdup here from the state's perspective?
Well, I don't think there was a holdup. I think that Alex said what he wants to say, but the real reality of what happened was that having Judge Newman set the trial date for this week and us on the state side moving to try this case, that ultimately forced him to a realization that he was going to have to take a result far worse than he ever wanted. So that really was what drove the ship. You can take Alec for what he said, but what really drove the ship was that we were prepared to try the case this week, and that forced him into the decision that he made here today. Yeah.
Do you think Alex Murdaugh has any remorse for the financial crimes he admitted to today?
I'll let y'all be the judge of that.
Can you tell us why the roadside shooting event was not wrapped up into these?
Sure. So this was, again, we were in trial for, preparing for trial this week for state grand jury matters. And state grand jury is different, as I just explained. It operates kind of on its own docket. So when this plea deal started to develop, I made it very clear that we were not going to blend things together. This was state grand jury and state grand jury only, and so those were the only charges that we resolved. It was the jurisdictional basis that we were here in court for. And I'll take just a couple more.
What happens next with those charges? Do you plan to press forward with them, or are they going to take after that?
Well, again, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. They're pending charges, so I'm not going to comment any further on that.
What's next?
What's next? Well, what's next is that obviously we have to litigate the juror motion, which we will do so whenever that is set. And again, we will start focusing on other priorities of the state grand jury. And I mentioned a couple of those. We've developed a partnership with SCDC to try to fight the very difficult problems of corruption and contraband there. I'd urge y'all to go back and look at the press conference we had last week, and one particular example in which a child was molested in real time by an inmate directing that with use of a contraband cell phone and an accomplice on the outside. Something that, again, those are the allegations there that I think need to be addressed. Another focus of the state grand jury is fentanyl trafficking, and then there's always corruption cases and other complex white-collar cases that we're working on. But this saga is not over. We still have charges pending against Russell Lafitte, and those obviously we will pursue aggressively as well.
Speaking of the roadside shooting, will you guys handle that, or will that be somebody else?
The roadside shooting we will handle, and again, I don't want to comment any further because those are pending. All right, last one. Who gets it? Nobody? All right, thank y'all.